Welcome to the Bupkes talk about Bupkes as we navigate the buttons on the Substack app. I think we could have an entire podcast just about how to navigate the over-engineered platform that we both use.
I'm sure
So,
it'll be fascinating.
Elia Ayoub, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Fellow Substacker, mostly known, at least in the Substack world, with your Hauntologies
Yeah.
platform,
Yeah.
which is super interesting. We're going to get into that.
Thank
And
you.
sort of the one of the brain trusts behind from the Periphery Media sort of podcast universe. I was just saying a few minutes ago before we went live, your prolific ability to create and produce and write and think it puts people like us here at the Bupkes. Really, what we're doing in comparison is truly Bupkes. Is truly, I would say, nothing.
Uh,
So what?
so I learned what the term Bupkes is when you messaged me.
Good. And what did you learn?
Nothing, right? Like it's basically it's like talking about it's like talking about nothing. Is that right?
Absolutely, Bupkes. I mean, literally, Bupkes is goat
Right.
goat dung, goat manure. But
Right.
it comes into Yiddish most colloquially as nothing. Your Bupkes, or you're talking about Bupkes, or this is Bupkes. Usually accompanied with a very Jewish kind of Ashkenazic shrug of the shoulders.
Yeah.
Like a Larry David kind of Bupkes.
I
But
get it. Okay. Yeah.
But counterintuitively, the work you're doing is anything but Bupkes, I would say. I mean, your topics are quite diverse. Everything from Lebanese cinema to, of course, things happening in Israel, Palestine, and the Levant more broadly. You bring in historical themes. You talk about sort of the clash of Hebrew and Yiddish in the lead up to the foundation of the state of Israel, which is also, is there a thread what is the thread that connects all the various things you talk about and write about?
If I don't know if there's one thread, but I guess I'm generally a very curious person. That's not like this always been a thing, something I've both enjoyed and also at times it's kind of been annoying because I couldn't like let something go, stuff like that. Um, the ones you described, so the Yiddish and Hebrew stuff, that was my master's thesis, and the Lebanese cinema, that's been my PhD. So I also had the time to kind of dig deeper into these specific topics. A lot of what I do tends to be in one way or another related to kind of authoritarianism and concerns over authoritarianism, how to fight it, stuff like that. And of course that, it definitely would spill over, bleeds into studying the far right, conspiracy thinking, all of that stuff, and how like what does it look like when a society normalizes talking points that were previously associated with the far right, stuff like that. And then it's kind of a matter of like, who am I in contact with? Like, for example, I know a lot more about Ukraine and Hong Kong because I happen to know more Ukrainians and Hong Kongers than I do, I don't know, Belarusians and Taiwanese, to just use two random examples. And that kind of, would change, of course, with time and stuff like that. And I'm part of various collectives, various informal signal group chats and shit like that. And so some things I end up becoming more familiar with than others. And it's always like a learning process.
Yeah. And of course, none of these topics you work on are relevant at all for our current state of affairs in the world, of course.
No, never. Everything's fine.
And you really got started, if I understand right, you got started very much in the activist scene in Lebanon, where you're from, of course.
Yeah.
Tell us more about that. There's of course so much that one can protest and so many issues to have to confront in a country like Lebanon. What got you involved in some of these issues?
Yeah, so a combination of happenstance, and again, that curiosity has always been there. But I became I started my undergraduate studies in end of 2010 at the American University of Beirut, so in Beirut. And I'm not from Beirut. I'm from like the small town in the mountains. And when I started university, that's also when the Arab Spring started, like almost like to the month. and in Egypt and Tunisia, obviously at the beginning, and then Syria. I came to Syria early 2011, and so I was in contact also with just a bunch of people who, excuse me, a bunch of like students who, because AUB is kind of one, I don't know if it still is, but at the time was like a bit of a cultural hub, I guess, education wise, and so you had just a bunch of people from those areas, those places, and I got to meet a bunch of them. And at the same time, partly because of that, but also because I've always wanted to do it, I launched a blog. Apologies for the coughing. I'm a bit sick.
That's okay.
I launched a blog with the funny name Hummus for Thought, which I always found amusing. And it was kind of just this English blog on when blogging was a thing, basically, human rights related stuff in Lebanon. I focused a lot on migrant domestic workers struggling, which continues to this day under the kafala system, LGBTQ rights, minority rights, that sort of thing. At the time, very much from a human rightsy discourse liberally, I would say. I've always seen myself as more radical than liberals, but kind of the language I was using was sort of that language. And progressively with time, that sort of expanded, and I got more radical or whatever. At least I think my reading of things got a bit more sophisticated. And in 2015, I moved to London to do my studies, and I've been mostly in and out of Lebanon since, and been based in the UK, then Switzerland, then the UK again. And that has brought me a lot of other stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that transition from going from your home country of Lebanon, well, actually, coming from the province, like a small area of Lebanon, to the capital of the country, and then from there moving into Western Europe.
Yeah,
that must have been a big transition for you.
Yeah, it's kind of it's okay. I know, obviously, there is now the association because J.K. Rowling is not a nice person, but I grew up. I did read the Harry Potter books when I was a kid, and they were actually. I was of that generation. I was with those kids that kind of got into reading through those books, and so I imagined at the time it's like living in that small village in Surrey, and then you go to London King's Cross, and then you meet all of those people. And so it was a bit like that. Where I grew up was very there's no good way of putting it. Like, it's very homogeneous, or at the very least it sees itself as that. It's actually more diverse, as most places are. But the people I grew up with, like, diversity in my private Catholic school was like, there were two people who were evangelicals.
Whoa.
Like those were the others. And when I was 15, I moved to another school. Just to give you like an example of how things were, I moved to another school, and there was one Muslim girl out of like 140 students, and we became friends because both of us were. She didn't have to go to church, and I wanted to avoid church, so we became friends like that. And so yeah, but that's what I mean. Like, there wasn't that exposure in my immediate surroundings to like anything that I would consider to be diversity, or like a more interesting ways of life, or just more people in general, or more different people. So I escaped via the internet. That coincided with the Harry Potter books, as I mentioned, came out when I was like 11, 12. And I was around that time when my English became pretty fine. And so I was able to escape through the internet, the English being, of course, the dominant language of the internet at the time and to this day. And this kind of just gave me this way out, if that makes sense, kind of this escape. And that's how I got into all of these other things, some of which continues to this day. Like, my fascination with Tolkien and stuff like that started at the time. It's part of the reason why I ended up moving to the UK. Just random, not random, like these connections that don't always make sense at the time, that somehow make sense later on, and whatever.
Right. And so for our listeners, who don't want to deal with, who need a break from the horrible crimes that we have to witness all the time, they should definitely visit you on all of your Trekkie adventures as well. I think that must be a nice distraction.
It is. So I started the podcast with my friend Carla Joy Bergman on Star Trek, called "Resistance is Fertile." For those who don't know, it's a reference to the Borg, one of those species in Star Trek that says resistance is futile. And we're like, this is a play on words. And so we did that. And we're going to have the second episode today or tomorrow. So it's very, very new. But like, we're just going to chat on, themes related to, of course, Star Trek, the Star Trek universe, but also like the importance of political storytelling. That's sort of what it is about. Star Trek is just the thing that we're going to use to talk about that. Anarchism and, related themes and, just have fun, to be honest.
Fun. Yes, I think I've heard of this word fun. And of course, I think Star Trek has lessons. I think for all of us, as does Harry Potter. Although, like you said, when I go to London or to England more broadly, I'm regularly assuming that Harry Potter is just a factual documentary. That's how I've always thought of things. But
Absolutely.
maybe I'm alone on maybe I'm alone on that.
I mean,
Resistance is fertile.
I lived by King's. So I lived by King's Cross for the first year when I did my master's, and so King's Cross obviously is where, because there was like the student dorms, and King's Cross is obviously what the whole platform 9 3/4 is. So like every September, is it? I think every September something, you will have like an annoying number of tourists who are there just for that, because they put the clock and leaving to King is so fucking annoying. But besides, it was fun when for however long that lasted for me.
Well, the UK has to find some ways to bring in some money. After Brexit and given its state of affairs right now, I think
Yeah,
they'll take anything.
I think
But
so.
it's interesting. You say you got lost in the internet. The internet, in a way, saved you or opened you up to new worlds. Because these
Yeah.
days, it's the opposite that we hear so
Oh
often.
yeah. Oh
The
yeah.
internet, the internet turns angry men into angrier men, and it
Yeah.
turns into people into misogynists
Yeah.
and violence and down far right conspiracy theory holes. So why was it
Yeah.
different? Why was it different for you?
Yeah, I do feel I genuinely feel bad for like younger folks. I'm 34, so I'm like
You're
the
old, old.
I'm old, I'm ancient, a younger millennial. I'm not even the older millennial. But no, there was a phase, like I did actually go through a phase of like, the new atheists.
Tell us
That
about
phase
that.
of like Christopher Hitchens, Dawkins, those guys,
Mm,
Sam Harris, that I absolutely abhor now. I went through a phase of like, because I grew up in an extremely conservative religious environment, and as I mentioned, largely Catholic. It was very much a way for me to say like, fuck all of that. And they were like, I had never heard people like, whatever people, even though they weren't from where I was, like just openly mock and insult religion. And that for me
right.
was a bit kind of freeing at the time. That was before I kind of understood that the underlying motive of all of that wasn't actually, it was Islamophobia. It wasn't like anything else. And that's I went through a process of de-radicalization, if you want. But also I wasn't like insanely into it or anything like that. It was just there was this moment of curiosity. So when for example, I listened to a couple of episodes of Sam Harris, I think last year or something. And of course, I had known by then, because as I mentioned, I would do research on the far right and conspiracy thinking and all of that stuff, that he very much went down that road of thinking that he's above politics or whatever, but effectively he's just normalizing far right rhetoric and discourse. That's why I kind of realized that, like, I kind of, I avoided something much darker, I feel. But like I don't know. I didn't go through that. I don't think I've To be fair to myself, I don't think I would ever have kind of gotten that bad or that extreme. Mostly because I don't understand and never have, and maybe this is an autism thing, I don't know. But like I don't understand people who think, even like for example, I didn't know any gay people until I don't know a certain age, but I never understood why if you're not gay, that's like any of your business or you should give a shit or whatever. I never got that understanding or that whatever this desire to control other people or to feel like the way I live or what I think or who I'm attracted to or whatever is the way. It just felt very weird for someone to be that self-confident. I never had that amount of self-confidence, and I don't understand people who do. And I think that kind of shielded me from a lot of shit. But also, like at the time, the internet, like it was just less. There were lots of dark shit. I saw a lot of horrible shit on the internet, um, but it wasn't as controlled as it is now. It wasn't as gated as it is now. Now it's much more gated. I didn't have to be on one specific platform to do absolutely everything. And it was much much more fluid, which is of course the original version or the vision of the internet than it is now. And social media at the time was relatively innocent. Facebook was kind of nice, which is not
I
not
barely
absolutely
remember the
anymore.
days.
I know. But like I was on Facebook groups and I met like genuinely interesting people. And there was even a period of time like I went through a phase of like a few years where I basically became a Buddhist. And there was a phase where on Facebook search, you could like search everything in detail. And so I could literally write location Lebanon, religion Buddhism, and I would just randomly message people who call themselves Buddhists in Lebanon. This is just it was just messy and stuff like that. And unfortunately, it just doesn't really exist anymore. Not to that extent. And so now it's much darker, as you mentioned.
The internet is itself a more authoritarian place these days.
I think so. Yeah.
I think we have like the authoritarian reality and the authoritarian virtual reality. I think track each other.
Yeah.
Very,
No, absolutely. I mean,
very
they
much
at this
so.
point the separation between IRL, like in real life, and virtual is kind of it's not necessarily it's not a rigid line. It's more fluid.
Yeah. So you mentioned some of the dark shit you were seeing then. I mean, what's some of the dark, maybe even the dumbest shit that you're seeing now? I mean, I know that if you follow Elia on Blue Sky, which I highly recommend, you do a good job, tracking a lot of the bullshit that's out there. Maybe you can run through some of that with us. What's kind of hitting your radar right now?
So some of it is not new, right? Like if I talk about because my like academic background is cultural studies, which includes media studies, and media criticism, and some of kind of the same critiques that we had, like to the run up to the Iraq War in 2003 and stuff. It's kind of still with us. In some cases, a bit better. Like for example, like 20 years ago, you would not have a single Palestinian on CNN. Like it's a kind of crumbs, and I'm not saying it's like I'm super grateful for CNN to finally allow people like me to be on their screens. It's just like objectively, I can kind of identify, okay, well, this trend is going in that direction or whatever.
Mm. It's a very low bar. We live in an era of
Extremely
very,
low
very
bar.
low bars. Careful not to
Yes, it
trip
is.
over it.
It's an extremely low bar, exactly. Some of the media discourses are those that bother me the most, especially when it comes from institutions that consider themselves to be above and above. Like the BBC clearly doesn't see itself as low quality as like I don't know, the Daily Wire or something. It clearly sees itself, and I'm talking BBC News specifically, which is different than the other stuff. Um, it clearly has these high what they consider to be these high editorial standards.
Mm.
Same for AP News, same with AFP, Reuters, The Guardian, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's a lot of cross pollination between them anyway. Apologies again. And so when I'm able, because I'm of my background, I'm just able to take what they consider to be their standards and then try and apply to their own writing and their own coverage. And you can see a very clear discrepancy between, for example, when they cover Ukraine and when they cover Palestine. Not to use an example that's always used, but it is true. And on Ukraine, it's largely more or less good coverage in the sense that they do prioritize, for example, Ukrainian voices when it's Russia Ukraine involved. They still do have a priority in general with having like quote unquote local experts, i.e. like British think tank people and whatnot. That's always been the case when I talk about the BBC here. So I have all of these underlying things. These really bother me, and sometimes it's like it's almost, I don't know, I'm like nitpicking a detail that may or may not be that important, but other times it's egregious and it's really insulting. And so you have that kind of that degree of variation. The other things relate to, I think, what most people already think about these days, which is like, the Elon Musk of it all, the Trump of it all of that stuff. I try not to make it too much center of my life because it's too much already.
Mm.
But like it is something that of course impacts us in very concrete ways. And I try and understand it in ways that I feel a lot of people often. So this is something I've realized a lot. A lot of people assume that if there's someone in power, that means that someone in power is very smart. And they're thinking very rationally, the kind of this cold genius behind closed doors and thinking long term and playing 5D chess and whatever, when their own eyes are telling them that that person is a very stupid person. It's just that person has a lot of power. And so there is when power is, especially when it's that great, I found, and I mean, I'm not inventing the wheel here. I'm not the first person to say this. It almost becomes like, there's a word I'm thinking of. I can't think of it right now. Like it becomes so big, it's invisible. It's like the air you breathe.
It
And so
just
you think,
consumes the entire view.
exactly. Like it's just, it's almost like you assume that because it's there and because it's kind of functioning in the sense that it's affecting your life or affecting the world around you, then there must be a good reason as to why it exists. When like quite often the answer is it exists because it does. and because it can, and because it has the power to do so, you know? And so I think of this a lot. Like my in-laws are Italians, for example, and you know, rational. They would consider themselves like center-left progressives and so on. But it doesn't. I've had this conversation a bunch of times. I'm just using them as an example here. There's nothing actually particularly egregious about themselves personally. But like it's very difficult for them to even imagine that the EU, for example, is complicit in the genocide in Gaza. And even if I point like this and this and this and take my time and so on, there's like this filter because it's personal. Like if that is true, that means so many of the things that I would imagine that's kind of how the thinking goes, you know? If this thing is true, that means that this other thing might also be true, and I'm not ready to let go of this other thing. So it's no longer about that specific thing. So it's no longer about like whether the EU itself is good, bad, or whatever, because of course you have these when it comes to like these gigantic infrastructures and whatnot, it's not as simple as good, bad anyway. But like if I'm talking about like what on this specific thing, this is actually why, and I can cite like a European human rights lawyer and the Court of Human Rights or Amnesty International, whatever, like sources that they would take seriously. Because if I tell them, well, the people I'm talking to are saying this doesn't really do much, it it's not like they would disagree with me, but it's like it's almost like there's something in them that prevents them from reaching the conclusion that for me, I think, and again, I don't know if this is an autism thing or not. I don't necessarily think it is, but I don't know. But for me, it's I don't have this thing that stops me from reaching the conclusion that I think is a natural conclusion, if that makes sense. And so these are some of the examples, and I find this a lot of times, and that's why for me it's becoming easier to sort of understand or to accept that people can have beliefs in themselves that don't necessarily have to make sense, and they can be even contradictory, as long as there is some kind of internal coherence to it all, as long as there's some kind of story that they tell themselves, or you know, stuff like that, and it becomes much messier in that regard.
I think what you're touching on is cognitive dissonance, which is
Oh yeah.
very much a challenge for most people, I would say.
Yeah. It's also it's cognitive dissonance. It's like it's also world building. Like people, you think of yourself as part of something, and of course your role in it and who you are. That ends up becoming very, very difficult to disentangle when you have to ask yourself difficult questions of whether you have participated in something that is not ideal or even evil or bad or whatever. That becomes much more difficult than just telling someone, yeah, like if we do this and if we tax the rich 1% higher, then we can fix everything or whatever like that. When the more abstract you make it, the easier it is for people to, in general, for people to sort of engage with. And that's where storytelling can actually be useful as a bit of a hack, if that makes sense. You're allowing people to take that step back, to have this suspension of disbelief, to escape or whatever, but you are still talking about things that are potentially, at the very least, that depends, of course, how you do it, pretty radical. And that does allow, I've had conversation with people who maybe might even call themselves liberals and whatnot. But then suddenly you talk to them about Star Wars Andors, and they're here they are supporting a working class uprising against the ruling elite. That's what I'm talking about. That is what we're talking about here. You know, but it takes some time to disentangle these two.
Yeah, the problem I find though with that is people will root for the underdog in Star Trek or root for the underdog in Star Wars, but there's still that break in logic to then bring it into the real world, to bring it into people's actual lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
And of course, I don't have like the answer. I think part of the I don't know part of why that happens, I feel, is an assumption of what is realistic and what is not. Like the world, you know, we live in this world. Sure, it's not ideal, but there's a reason to it. And again, this is all the realism of it all. And part of the difficulty, I think, is unsettling that assumption, that realism, that actually realism is an ism. There's a whole lot of assumptions that, of course, in my field, at the very least, you can study of what people think the world can and cannot be. And the challenge is like, how do you then, you know, how do you push the needle? How do you widen that circle and so on?
have you seen that change in the last? I mean, if we just want to focus in on what the crimes that Israel's been committing in Gaza since the 7th of October, forget about the crimes that have been going on for decades before that.
Yeah.
But have you seen the needle shift on that? Have you seen that circle widening?
On Israel Palestine specifically, yeah. I mean, when I did the thesis like 10 years ago now, it was sort of a gigantic deal that this one candidate, Bernie Sanders, did not even go to APAC. And then again, but it goes back to what we started this conversation. And these are very low. This is a very low bar. But then, it became actually pretty kind of politically inconvenient for a lot of high-ranking Democrats to go to APAC at all, not just like Bernie Sanders. You have just, and the rise of Jewish Voice for Peace and how it's become more normalized to have a bunch of like Jews, especially like Jewish Americans and others, to call themselves anti-Zionists. That was something that for me, like growing up, was like it was very difficult for people like me, like Arabs, Lebanese, Palestinians, whatever, who saw themselves as part of this global community and maybe in this bit of a naive way, and see like not enough voices say the things that for us felt very obvious should be said if you are, for example, on the left, or even if you're a liberal, like even if you're center left or whatever. And that has shifted. I mean, objectively, that has shifted. Where this leads and so on, of course, this is very much an open question and something that we need to build on. And it's clearly not sufficient to actually stop the horrors right now. That's very obvious. But there's no doubt that like there has been this shift, what to do with it and so on. I think this, as I said, is something to be acted upon rather than to take for granted.
One thing I was thinking about when reading a lot of your biographical background and a lot of things you write now and talk about, to what extent does your experience of activism and being part of the civil society in Lebanon apply to you now in a UK context where you live, given how much destruction there's been to civil society in Western Europe, in the United States, that things that we see in authoritarian states or in non-democracies creep in to places that are supposed to have more rule of law. I'm curious how that's informed your work now.
It's definitely, I mean, yeah, it's a big part of just what I do as well, because I'm an immigrant here. I'm luckier than others in the sense that I'm married to an EU citizen. So there was a whole Brexit thing, obviously, and so the people who were already there, which was the case of my partner, got a special status, and so I got it through marriage. I got that one. So I'm less precarious, legally speaking, than I was when I was still a student here, and even when I was a tourist here. So that's like there's that in the background. But to answer your question more specifically, I found, I don't know if this is I'm not going to say it's just a Western thing, because anything related to memory and how memory is either politicized or how, like, especially forgetfulness is politicized. And for example, in Lebanon, we have a huge problem with even remembering the past 5 years, let alone, or 5 years, maybe not, but like the past 10 years, let alone 20, 30, 40 years. And the big period of violence, which are what we call usually the Civil War between 75 and 1990, are very much still with us, which hence hauntologies and the ghosts of the past, and all that, hence why all of that is. And the PhD was very much a PhD on hauntologies and temporality and political temporalities through cinema. Because in Lebanese cinema, just to say quickly, in Lebanese cinema, a lot of the themes that were discussed after the formal end of the wars, are on the wars. So very much like speaking to this, like how it's not over and it's still haunting us and all of that stuff. But what I found, like, for example, if we want to focus on the UK, the UK had a civil war, a very long one. If you talk, they call it in this very British way, the Troubles. But it was a civil war in Northern Ireland, of course. And so fundamentally, if you're studying things like sectarianism, there are similarities between a Bosnia, a Lebanon, a Iraq, and a Northern Ireland. But what changes is the context in which these things develop. So there is this phenomenon of sectarianization. People are not born one thing or another. And even if you're born into a certain religious community or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that that specific identity is going to be politicized in a certain way rather than another way. This has very specific, like, historical context, why one religious group was uplifted economically over another. This, may have to do, in Lebanon, for example, the Maronites, which is a community I come from, were supported and even boosted by the French during the colonial mandate. There's a very concrete reason as to why that thing happened. It didn't have to happen. They could have decided not to do that, you know? And so you have all of these very concrete things. And in Northern Ireland, for example, you have lessons. Like, what are certain things that worked in Northern Ireland that did not work in Lebanon? A lot of it is luck, in the sense that both Northern Ireland and Ireland, before Brexit, were both part of the EU, because Northern Ireland, being part of the UK, was, of course, also part of the EU. This means that certain things like freedom of movement, like can I live here or can I live there, they didn't really have to bother with because it was already guaranteed by the fact that those two nations were part of this wider structure. And as flawed as that wider structure is, it did allow them this specific thing. And you didn't have that in Lebanon, and of course you didn't have that in Iraq, and of course you didn't have that in Bosnia. So you have these very specific things that you can then see. Okay, this is why this worked. This might be why, and this is why this did not work, and this might be why. And most importantly, I think you de-essentialize the context you come from, and that is something that I think a lot of people, especially in the West, I don't know if it's a specifically Western thing. I mean, certainly in India, it's a big problem, and Japan. I don't. I can think of lots of examples where this is also a huge problem. Have a difficulty de-essentializing where they live or the context where they live could be like the UK, or could be like the UK as part of the West, as part of Europe, if not the EU, etc., etc. And that the more complicated, messy things, those things happen over there, not over here. Like this whole over there, over here, is I do think overall is a universal problem, although probably you see it more in the global north than the global south. Possibly because I think people in the global north can afford it more.
And no one wants to be the bad guy, right? Nobody wants to see themselves as culpable or responsible for crimes everyone wants to be the good guy, right? The proverbial sketch, are we the baddies?
Yeah, David Mitchell, yeah. It's a big thing. Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely, I agree.
Yeah. Well, a half hour into us talking, I think this seems like the podcast appropriate time to welcome to our listeners here that this is talking about Bupkes, and we have Elia Ayoub on with us, a prolific writer, thinker, talker of a whole bunch of important things, everything from what's going on in Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, blowback here in what we might call the West, or crumbling empire of the West. And so I think I want to do a little bit of a shift in that point. I'm fascinated by how your master's and subsequent writing focuses on this sort of internal Jewish struggle in Hebrew and Yiddish and its role in the rise of Zionism. My first question is, this seems like this is a very internal Jewish question. This is a question that people like at the Bupkes would be interested in. But what is, one might think, like, what is a Lebanese guy interested in this for? This seems like something totally not related. So what brought you to be interested to dig into this idea or dig into the history of this, what I would call the Hebrew-Yiddish death match?
Well, one of the scholars I cited in the thesis called it a Kulturkampf, like a cultural war, basically.
Right.
So there's that. What brought me to it? I mean, honestly, part of the answer is very boring. It's just that I found I was at the SOAS library, and it's still to this day one of my favorite places, although I haven't been there in almost a decade, because it's very cozy. It's kind of small. I like shapes, and the convenient books on the Middle East and there was of course a Jewish studies section and whatnot, all next to one another, which I really appreciated. And so what I was deciding literally what could my master's be, and my initial thought would be, let's do something on Lebanon. And then I very much said, I don't want that because I'm from there. I'm going to do something else now. I got through a number of books, and I flipped through some books, and I don't remember which one was the first one that I got to, but it may be a book called Poetic Trespass by Lita Levy, which I actually have in front of me here. And the subtitle of that book is fascinating. It says, writing between Hebrew and Arabic in Israel, Palestine. And so that, I think from what I remember, it's been a while, but from what I remember is it's about Palestinians who wrote in Hebrew and Israelis who wrote in Arabic, something like that, or those who wrote in between, stuff like that. And that led me, one thing leads to another. And again, it's that same section in the Jewish studies, which is next to MENA studies and so on. To then, there was a book, I think, on Yiddish in Palestine. It may be I think, Babel in Zion or something like that it was called. Yeah, it's actually called Babylon Zion. It's in front of me. And so that sparked my curiosity. I read a bit and whatnot. And I just was very confused. And I do think from what I remember, there was this one story, and I used it in the thesis at the beginning, of David Ben-Gurion is in, I'm going to say Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, I don't remember where. And he receives this hero of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And she's talking and whatnot. And then while he was thanking her after her speech, he complains about the language that she uses, which is Yiddish. He calls it like a foreign grating language, I believe is how he put it. And it's a for me it was a very weird thing to read that because the guy was himself a Yiddish speaker, and also I never a native, and also I never heard of like a context in which there's such a rejection of something as in my head as neutral as a language. But of course, it's not neutral, and that led me to that rabbit hole that ended up becoming the thesis. But there is a direct link, which at the time I didn't necessarily make it, but in the sense that my grandfather is or was, he passed away, a refugee from the Nakba. He was Palestinian from Haifa, and of course the advent of Zionism is a direct link to that, and so there is that indirect link, if you want. The Kulturkampf, as I mentioned, like this whole thing is not the thing that led to the Nakba, of course, but it was like just part of that wider story that I ended up kind of being interested in.
Well, it's fascinating because, from if you grow up in the Zionist propaganda, like I had the misfortune or maybe the fortune of growing up in, because it exposed me and inoculated me to a lot of the garbage that gets talked about now. You never hear about this, right? The Yiddish speakers miraculously became Hebrew speakers, became, the Sabras to make the
Mm-hmm.
desert bloom and make,
Mm-hmm.
drain the swamps and all of that nonsense that, of course, tells you, very little of what actually happened at that time
Yeah,
in the,
yeah,
the
yeah.
19th, 20th centuries. You never hear about this. My grandmother, a Yiddish speaker, because
Mm,
she would sit at the top of her stairs in Queens, New York, and listen to her parents yell at each other in Yiddish. So she as a child learned Yiddish so she could hear what they were talking about, as little
mm,
children like to do. She would never know this, proud of, like so many liberal American Jews, never thinks twice about, the goodness of Israel and that whole Zionist, story arc, not even aware of this history that actually, the you have the Zionist campaign against Palestine and Palestinians, of course, but this at the same time, this internal domination campaign
yeah,
against everything that was diasporic, right?
yeah, yeah.
Why is this not better known?
Uh, Lots of reasons. I mean, part of a lot of the reason has to do with just I don't know. There's probably a better word for it, but like convenience. Like this story as told of like the small nation against a wider army, a sea of Arabs, as they put it, is a nice story to tell. It's sort of like a David versus Goliath thing. There's also, of course, it kind of links to that story as well. And the facts, as we know from most stories, just don't matter. It doesn't matter that the Israelis were actually the bigger force and much more organized and better armed, including, ironically, by Stalin at the time. Many people don't know that. Um, but all of these things, like the Haganah, I believe, was the one that was owned by Stalin via the Czech or something like that. Um, but yeah, anyway, the convenience is part of it. There was kind of this more increased interest after 67. So it's not so much after 48. Between 48 and 67, the support or the interest was sort of like, I don't know. It's not that it wasn't there. It was, but it wasn't as directly invested in the same way, in the same of people like who are not Israelis identifying almost like as like this thing, this state over there, very far away, is also a big part of my identity. There's very much something that was built up over time, and I do think in the end it was a story of convenience. It's linked to how in the West in general, and I think this is more of a European problem, although the Americans have their own kind of baggage with that. How they tell the story of World War II, it's very much a like they did this over there and we were the good guys going to stop the bad guys. There's no like understanding of like the colonial roots of the Holocaust or the links between how Hitler himself admired America. And I believe one of his carriages was called America because he admired the cowboy versus Indian thing. And it was one of the things that he read a lot. These things are things that you get if you're also like maybe privileged enough to have a certain access to a certain type of education, and of course, if you're surrounded by people who are interested in these things, as I was at SOAS and so on. So there is a bit of that convenience. But I don't, in the spirit of de-essentializing something as well, I don't necessarily think that there's something particularly um, like unique. I mean, everything is unique and everyone, whatever. Like, but there isn't something that's like so out of the ordinary with the example that you mentioned. Because I can even think of like I grew up, as I mentioned, in the community that I mentioned, and a lot of them wouldn't like a lot of Maronites. especially, of course, if they're on the right, which on average, I would say most of them are, if they're middle class and Maronites, I mean, specifically, wouldn't even see themselves as Arabs, for example. They may call themselves Phoenicians, they may just call themselves Lebanese, and all of that. And most importantly, like they, even if they are not, like I've grown up in that community, as I said, even if they may not, for example, identify with the Kataib or the Phalangists, what this right-wing party that were the ones that were allied with the Israelis during the occupation and so on, um, even if they don't necessarily identify with them, they would still hold some members of that party, for example, like Bashir Mayil, as like it's very difficult for them to imagine that he was like a war criminal, which he absolutely was. And so I grew up around war criminals. Like I grew up, there would be like posters of like Elia Ayoub, who was like one of the instigators of Sabra and Shatila, for example, one of the persons behind it. And they were like, in memoriam because he was killed in the 90s after the war. And there'd be like a church not far from where I grew up that had masses to this guy who was a mass murderer. And the cognitive dissonance is absolutely there. Like my father, who was, as I said, like the son of the grandfather, so himself Palestinian, was in the Red Cross. And so he also witnessed part of Sabra and Shatila towards the end when they allowed the Red Cross to go into the camps on the third or fourth day. I don't remember when. And so he also grew up in the same community that I grew up in. So that includes people who even would call themselves far right and fascists. The fact that he was Palestinian didn't seem to bother them as much because, well, at least you're Christian. And so you have all of these ways in which people will find ways to justify or explain or whatever themselves or their part in something wider, or they would, it's either the classical, I was just following orders, or there was like, I personally didn't do this. I was just a clerk, or I personally didn't do this because it happened over there, not over here, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't surprise me that this also happened in like other communities and whatnot. I think the difference is, again, it goes back to when power is invisible, in the sense that if we're talking about America in this case, the America of it all, if there wasn't this support from the United States, especially from the 60s onwards, I don't, maybe it would still exist, but it may not be as impactful on my life and on the life, obviously, of millions of Palestinians and Lebanese and others as it is now. So there are these other things that kind of affect this underlying phenomenon and make it worse, or at least render its impact worse than it could have otherwise. Because the example that I mentioned is extremely bad if you're a Syrian refugee or a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon. But if you're not in that context, and if you live, I don't know, in Venezuela or in Norway or whatever, you can kind of probably go through your entire life without knowing anything about Lebanon and not giving a shit, and probably won't affect you in the same way. Or at the very least, you wouldn't think about it as much. It may affect you in one way or another, and you maybe in ways you don't know or whatever. But it's not as much in your face as like if it's America and Israel.
Right. I mean, why should someone in Thailand be worried about something happening that's very much a Western problem?
Yeah.
It's it's so interesting how these things can be reframed. I mean, you mentioned the underdog thing, in terms of Zionist mythology and really Western mythology.
Yeah.
Again, we're going back to our Star Wars or our Star Trek, and I wouldn't dare mix up the two, of course, never do that. That how it's so easy that Israel is still seen as the underdog. This always amazes me.
Yeah.
In these kinds of narratives, such they have the amount of forces and the amount of technology as the U.S. military, but they don't have to spread it around the world. Or choose to spread it around the world. They could just focus it in a very, very concentrated area.
Yeah, but they can rely on things like numbers, and like we are only this many millions, and look at the map, it's very small. Look at how big Egypt is next to us. Look at how big Jordan, Saudi Arabia. Look at how so many Arabs, and this it's very visual as well. And I can absolutely imagine, especially like if you're an American, and America being of course one of the biggest countries, that this becomes almost like I don't know, maybe a visual thing. Like it's literally, oh, it's that small, it cannot be as powerful or as whatever as these other people are saying it is. So, one of the many reasons, then you would have that cognitive dissonance and so on.
This is probably why Donald Trump wants Greenland, because on the map it looks very big.
Exactly. Yeah. Things are that stupid.
Things really are like, I mean,
yeah. Yeah. As I said, a lot of the time, as I even with Donald Trump now, as I saw like a few hours ago, he's very pissed at Israel. People are shocked by that and whatnot. It's like, what? Like, the, it doesn't have to follow a script. Like you think that this is because this. I mean, okay, I understand why. To be fair, because an American president is saying something bad about Israel, and that's not exactly common. So I understand where that comes from.
I mean,
Um,
it seems worse. It seems worse to many people that he dropped the F bomb on Israel, worse than dropping bunker buster bombs on Iran.
Yeah, because it's not polite, and that's not how you do things on the international stage, and there is decorum and all of that stuff. In during the uprising so there were two uprisings, big uprising in Lebanon, 2015 and 2019. In 2015, I was part of the organizing committee, and I don't think it ended up very well, that uprising. 2019 was kind of the more radical and more interesting one. But in 2015, and a bit in 2019 as well anyway, but in 2015 especially, there was this whole discourse of like, it became a bit of a meme, in my circles, people who mock the or tease that, who are not happy about these things, of like, it's sort of a protester's etiquette, in the sense of like, how do you organize yourself in a protest? Like you have to be respectable, you have to not be mean at the cops, stuff like that. And that very much like genuinely, that's sort of the dividing line, if you want, between a lot of people who would see themselves as liberal, respectable, or whatever, and even conservatives, and the other people who don't. And that's like, for me, when I saw that, that line became blurrier in 2019, that's what told me that like, oh, this thing might be bigger than it is in 2015, because suddenly, instead of just having like either seasoned activists or working class men and radical protesters and whatever, fighting the cops or whatever it might be, you also had this much wider umbrella, if you want, of people, like, to use an American term, like soccer moms or whatever. And that's when I felt like, when my mom joined the uprising and the protest in 2019, that was one of the times where I felt, okay, there's something different about that. But a lot of people are still unwilling to let go of certain assumptions. Like, the whole bad apples among cops, it's still very common for many people to believe that, this is, for example, the ICE kidnappings now. Well, of course, I want ICE to be abolished, and that's very important, and hopefully it happens, and I don't know, whatever. But then even when that happens, it doesn't mean that the American state, as in and of itself, suddenly becomes, nice to migrants. And they have these different ways in which violence can be enacted, as long against innocent people, as long as it is kind of rationalized and justified, or talked about, hence the, again, storytelling, talked about in a specific way, in a certain way. I can give you another quick example.
Sure.
There's a weekly show here in the UK, Have I Got News to You, I think it's called, in which basically they summarize the news in this, there's a comedians on the panel and whatever. And when Keir Starmer had his speech, the prime minister here, a few weeks ago, basically saying that we're becoming an island of strangers, which has been compared to Enoch Powers, who's this kind of far right figure from the 70s, I believe, is when he made that speech of like the rivers of blood. And people compare that because the speech that Starmer made is indeed very right wing. Um, the only thing that the host kind of could could think of saying was that, it's not good the way he said it, but we do have an immigration problem. And it says, and then he gave statistics that, we were this many millions, and then we are this many millions, and if we don't stem the flow, whatever, within 10 years we'll be this many millions. And there's no kind of attempt to try and even understand, well, what is good or bad about the numbers that you just give, and is it just a matter of numbers? And also, what does that say? That we're at the stage where the comparison between the current prime minister, who is technically center left, with a figure who was, up until like 5 seconds ago, associated with some of the worst far right discourse in the UK, well, that's not just become normalized, but it's not even worth it's kind of a shrug thing. It's not even worth kind of, obsessing over or whatever. What does that say about the state of political discourse, mainstream political discourse in the UK? All of that is not mentioned because it remains within the realm of what's polite, polite discourse, what's acceptable. And my concern is when the needles gets, shifts towards the right, what becomes quote unquote acceptable in and of itself also shifts towards the right. And that is something that many people don't recognize.
And that's something, of course, we see in the European Union, where it's now totally normal to talk about deportation.
Yeah.
It's totally normal to forget about climate change. It's totally normal
Yeah.
to talk in this really crazy civilizational discourse, right? Us versus them.
Yeah.
It's very clear,
As long as you don't do it while yelling like Trump does.
right? As long as you don't yell it, say it in polite words.
Yeah.
The far right, or even the right. I mean, I think in many cases the right have become the far right.
Yes.
They'll say it in ways that make you feel uncomfortable, but people on the left or center left, liberals, Greens, whatever, they'll just say it a little bit more nicely. But and we see this, of course, in the United States as well. I mean, this is why it's hard to get too upset about Donald Trump's shenanigans, because much of what he says it in a more direct and uncomfortable way, but many of his actions are just a natural continuation of lots of things that have already been happening.
Yeah, and in that same logic, they also are the start of new things as well. So it's both, it's not an either or. I think it's both an and thing. And I think, there are certain things that have been normalized with him, Trump one, and then of course now with Trump two, that even if someone comes, like, when, I don't know, it was Trump one that, first term that moved the embassy to Jerusalem, but then Biden came after him and he did not unmove it. He kept it there. So, like, there are lots of things that then become normalized, and then who comes after has a choice, at least that movement or whatever, the people around them have a choice to either undo the damage or to take them for granted. And a lot of the time they end up taking them for granted.
Yeah. There's there's just the creep, right? The creep of once
Yes.
once something's there. They say this often about taxes. It's much harder to take a tax away once it's there. And
Yeah.
I think once these policies are in place, they're very hard to move back. It's just amazing to me the lack of sort of the lack of vision that there could be something else, right? That there can be an alternative.
Mhm.
There could be something new or different that's not
Yeah.
destructive.
Yeah.
So. But here we are. So what's next for you? Tell us as we're wrapping up. I know you got to go. You got family things to do.
Mhm.
What are you working on? What's next?
Uh, I'm the primary carer at home, so not much next for now in terms of like professional stuff. I'm just gonna continue doing the projects I do when I can, mostly when my kid goes to sleep. And I am working on a postdoc idea. So if that works out and gets funded, I'll probably do that next. I've applied basically because I'm officially unemployed at the moment, so I'm just looking for stuff. So once that,
You're one of these immigrants that they keep talking about,
yeah, yeah,
unemployed.
yeah, yeah. I keep on taking so many jobs.
Well,
Um, but
this
yeah,
explains all the projects. Well, um, to our people listening, and well, of course, we're the Bupkes is going to post this. If you not just live, it will live forever in the eternity of the bowels of the internet on
Mhm.
thebupkes.com, which you should subscribe to. You should also
Mhm.
subscribe to Hauntologies. You should follow
Mhm.
everything that Elia Ayoub does, because it's at the very least cathartic, but which is what the Bupkes tries to be as well. At the
Mhm.
very most, you might actually learn something. What's the best place where people where do you like to send people to Hauntologies or where?
Yeah, these days I guess hauntologies, and I'm more active on Blue Sky currently than I'm on Mastodon. And there's the various podcasts as where if I take a break from Blue Sky, which is I do this like semi regularly, I would probably continue releasing episodes. That's the thing I kind of do more regularly than anything else.
Very good. And yeah, this spate of podcasts from the Periphery Media, which is great. And the Bupkis is definitely specifically interested in this new one on Hidad Jewish counter colonial thoughts, which sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so there's Hida, which Hidah. So far, they only have 2 episodes, an introductory one, and the second episode, the first interview is with Daniel Boyarin, and they have a bunch of other guests lined up that they've already recorded. I'm helping them out. I'm basically a co-producer of that podcast, so I'm not one of the hosts, but I am going to be a guest on it at some point, so that's gonna be fun.
All right.
And yeah, it's already available.
All right. And host of the Fire These Times,
Yeah.
Elia Ayoub, thanks so much for your time. I hope you have a nice time doing your not work. Of course, it's very much work, being a primary caregiver, taking care of a child. I think we should honor and respect and acknowledge that that's just as much work as any other job in an office.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Thank you.
and
Thanks,
to our
thanks so much for
listeners,
having me.
thanks for tuning in to talk about Bupkis. There's going to be a lot more Bupkis in an era of exploding pagers. Everything is nothing. Everything
Yeah.
is Bupkis. I'm Noah Kluchovich. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.